Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. Lots of us here in Canada seem to know about some significant figures in the United States, such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman. Hell, some people might even know people like Angela Davis. But no one really knows about the lawyer and black rights activist Rocky Jones. And that's what's bothering me today. So, another organization that people might be at least familiar with in terms of the name is the Black Panther Party. And Rocky Jones is a Canadian who has some very interesting connections to the Black Panther Party. But before we get to that, let's get into a little bit more about this man in his early life. So, Jones spent much of his life fighting for social justice for not just black people, but also indigenous people. So, my man. And he was also a strong voice in the areas of human rights, race, and poverty. So already I'm hoping that people get a good appreciation for this guy. Rocky Jones was actually first born as Burnley Allen Jones in The Marsh, which was a black community in Truro, Nova Scotia. I hope once again we're noticing a pattern of a lot of really important and impressive black Canadian figures coming from Nova Scotia, but I digress. Now, if you're wondering, yes, Rocky Jones is related to Jeremiah Jones, who we also covered in a previous video. Jeremiah Jones is his grandfather. So, because of this, Burnley, soon to be Rocky Jones here, is already coming from an area knowing about, black pride and heritage and history. And his grandfather fought in the Battle of Vimy Ridge, one of the most pivotal battles in the Canadian mythological mindset. But he's encountering black racism at the age of 12 when he realized he wasn't allowed to bowl in the local bowling alley. He couldn't play pool in the pool hall. He couldn't eat at certain restaurants. So he suddenly becomes very aware that segregation is a thing. He would watch his white friends play pool and eat at these restaurants and stuff. And eventually the owner broke the unwritten race barrier and let Jones play with him. And when he became an adult, Jones would later reflect on this and call it one of his earliest victories. But it still shows how endemic the issue of segregation was in Nova Scotia and Canada at the time. But Rocky himself admits that all his early struggles didn't turn him towards hatred. He actually had this to say: "The prejudice and the discrimination and the racism that I have faced over my lifetime could have made me a hater. But my beginnings growing up in a small black community filled me with such love and compassion for others that hate was impossible for me to internalize." I need more people to recognize this man, because already we're just scraping the surface of this man and his story, and I'm already impressed. So at the age of 16, Rocky joins the military and he serves for 3 years. And so then when he leaves at the age of 19, he moved to Toronto and worked as a truck driver. It's while he was working in Toronto that he came across a protest at the United States consulate. He noticed that most of the protesters were white, yet they were protesting the fact that black Americans in Alabama could not vote and suffered violence for their political activism. And if you're wondering, yes, this was about the events that were happening in the Deep South under the leadership of Martin Luther King and various other civil rights leaders in the States at the time. So Jones joins this protest, and very quickly, being like the only black man there, is swarmed by journalists. And not being one to mince words, Jones had this to say: "Black people deserve to vote, and the FBI has to use its powers of arrest in Selma, Alabama." So, right, this is where things start to get a little crazy. Because of his very outspoken position on these issues, he very quickly becomes compared to a very prominent black leader of the Black Panthers called Kwame Ture. Now, media outlets nicknamed Jones Rocky the Revolutionary, which is how he eventually gets his nickname Rocky Jones. However, while this is how he first gets his nickname, and he was being compared to Kwame Ture, this was actually the first time he had heard of Kwame Ture. So the media is actually to thank for bringing him to his attention and to what happens next. Kwame Ture is widely credited with creating the refrain of Black Power, and Jones first found out about this after his comparisons to him by the media and began to adopt it as one of his own phrases. He eventually said that Black Power is recognition that power can bring about more changes than an appeal to man's morals. It is a concept of Black consciousness that needs to assert that Blacks can make decisions for themselves. Now, this is great and all, but you can already see that this is how he goes from being an early activist to now being radicalized and getting more in touch with Kwame Ture. And so what happens is in 1965, Rocky Jones moves to Halifax to pursue activism in Nova Scotia, knowing full well that, A, it's his hometown, it's his home province, and B, there's a huge issue of segregation that's going on there. So he sees that as his fight. However, his moving here and his comparison to Kwame Ture and the Black Panthers and adopting the rallying cry and trying to get more in contact with them and becoming more affiliated with them, well, this means that his connection with the Black Panthers brought him to the RCMP's attention. The RCMP tracked him and his wife for 11 years. The RCMP tapped their phones, they followed them home, they even intercepted their mail. Oh, and police stakeouts were not uncommon. So now, also unfortunately, at this point in time, Halifax is raising the community of Africville, and there's so much Black history. I was tempted to cover Africville, but I wanted some more positive things to wrap up the end of the month, and Africville is sadly not one of those. To briefly sum up, Africville was basically a small African-Canadian community, but people didn't want them living so close to Halifax, so it also became the site of the city's dump, and they never provided adequate services. And so eventually they said, oh, look, the community is falling apart. It better be demolished. And that's what they did. At this point in time, when Rocky Jones returned to Halifax was, or just to Nova Scotia in general, Halifax was razing the community of Africville to the ground. The police stepped up monitoring other Black Nova Scotians, including our boy Jones here, and they would go undercover into Black nightclubs, attend community meetings, monitor university students, stake out community leaders' homes. It was a thing that is not really talked about. We're all familiar with how this happened in the States. Here's the dirty secret. It happened here too. It's within this context of a police surveillance state over the Black community that Kwame Ture and Jones officially meet and make sort of a big splash in Nova Scotia. Jones actually meets Ture at a writers' conference in Montreal in 1968, and they actually become friends. Jones, also dealing with the struggle of Black liberation and equality in Canada, invites Kwame Ture to Nova Scotia. And he says, ostensibly there, he's inviting him to go fishing because Jones apparently loved fishing, and he also loved hunting, apparently. And Ture takes him up on this offer, and so they make plans for Ture to visit Halifax, and Jones is going to take him on a tour of the city. When Jones arrived at the Halifax airport with Kwame Ture, he's astonished at the police presence. The police have massive amounts of cars and officers at the ready in and outside the airport. They followed their car back into town. They staked out their home, and when they went to eat at a club, the police were sitting in their cars outside and standing outside, never taking their eyes off them. They were also perched on rooftops across the street. Police watched these two men for the 18-hour visit between Jones and Ture. So, yeah, that's a thing that's happened in Canadian history that we don't know about. A second Black Panther delegation was also invited to Halifax at the behest of Jones later that year in November, which just shows that Jones continued to fight the good fight. So in 1967, Rocky Jones and his then wife Joan helped create Quacha House, which was an international club of sorts where people could talk about the discrimination they faced and ways of combating it. One of the other things that was talked about at Quacha House was the lack of housing and education for people who are minorities. So whether they were Black, Indigenous, Asian, from the Indian subcontinent, Latin America, etc. And so it begins to become this forum, not just to air grievances and talk and share with community, but also to figure out ways of tackling inequality and how to move forward. This then leads Jones to create in 1968 the Black United Front of Nova Scotia, which was a grassroots organization of over 400 Black Nova Scotians, and the organization dedicated itself to obtaining Black equality in the political and economic fields, not just in Nova Scotia, but in society at large, if you will. While studying for his bachelor's degree in 1970, he actually helped Dalhousie University create the transition year program in order to try and get more Black and Indigenous youth studying at Dalhousie University. So he didn't just care about himself or his community. He saw the factors that played into discrimination and oppression and the lack of equality and fought to try and change that for the better. This would also lead to him throughout the 1970s traveling across Canada and the US to actually give speeches on oppression and liberation. And unfortunately, it is during this period where he's speaking truth to power that arsonists attack and set his home on fire, not once, but twice. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it still shows that we had a lot of work to do at this point in time, and the work still wasn't done. There was a case known as the Donald Marshall Jr. Inquiry, and it concluded that Nova Scotia's criminal justice system absolutely failed the Mi'kmaq at every turn. And this also forces Jones to, again, have a reckoning with how poorly people are treated in Nova Scotia and in Canada at large. And this kind of renews his activism, and this causes his push for more Black and Indigenous lawyers and judges to help offset the racist and discriminatory legal system in Nova Scotia and Canada in general. And Jones happened to be one of these very people. He actually became one of the first students to enroll in the program, ended up being class valedictorian when he graduated in 1992, and then he continued to practice law at Dalhousie Legal Aid for several years before founding B.A. Rocky Jones and Associates. And throughout this time, he also worked with Indigenous communities on legal issues involving land claims, justice, education, and the environment. He also became an advocate for prisoners' rights and helped establish the Black Inmates Association and the Native Brotherhood at prisons in Dorchester, New Brunswick, and Spring Hill, Nova Scotia. He also worked as the director for real employment opportunities for prisoners, or for prisoner employment or something like that is the title. And it's basically a self-help group for prisoners seeking work, because our system is notoriously bad for failing people when they get out of prison and they're trying to keep their noses clean and trying to get employment, but because they now have a criminal record, it is very difficult for them to do so. Continuing as a lawyer, he would preside over some very high-profile for the time cases, including a case before the Supreme Court of Canada where police in Halifax arrested a 15-year-old Black boy, simply known as RDS in legal documents, for allegedly interfering with the arrest of another youth. He successfully argued that the judge showed bias, and so they got a new trial. And he also argued for other high-profile cases in Nova Scotia, specifically Halifax, accusing police of racism. And he also helped the former residents of Africville fight for compensation for the destruction of their village. All in all, the man has been a tireless advocate for the rights of minorities, not just in his community in Nova Scotia, but across Canada. And his connection with the Black Panthers is also fascinating, and the role he plays in Nova Scotia, which in many ways I'm hoping people are starting to realize is kind of like our Alabama, and not in a good way. The segregation, the racism, the race riots, the vilification of black people who have been here for centuries. The idea of that history being a solely American problem is unfortunately not true. It's here in Canada. As we've seen with many of these stories, as we're seeing again with the tireless activism of Rocky Jones. While he did see improvements individually for a lot of black Canadians and saw progress, he still admitted near the end of his life that he felt that collectively the black community is still falling further and further behind as wealth inequality continues to grow. He's not wrong. And unfortunately, he died in Halifax on the 29th of July in 2013. He released, a biography was released posthumously called Burnley Rocky Jones, Revolutionary, and it was released in 2016. I encourage everyone to read that book. I've also ordered it myself, and I've added it to my already incredibly long reading list. But Rocky Jones is a fascinating figure and civil rights activist in Canadian history that we don't know about. Probably because if we did, we'd be confronted with the fact that, Nova Scotia is kind of our Alabama. And unfortunately, we Canadians really like to feel like we're better than the States on the issues of race and stuff, when really, as this whole series across February has proven, we're not. Rocky Jones is a fascinating and very interesting figure, and I wish more of us knew about him and really honored his legacy that he's left behind for not just black Canadians, but all Canadians who have had to deal with discrimination and poverty. I just think he should be far more celebrated than he is. And the fact that he isn't is what's bothering me today.